In 1983, aged 23, I got on a train at Victoria Station in London, headed for China. I had aspirations of being a photographer, but had little training and had done no research. I embarked with the naive confidence of a youngster. This is a series of 12 spoken narrative screen pieces compiled from the 15 rolls of black and white film I shot in the 4 months I spent travelling in China. They illustrate my journey as a young traveller and a photographer trying to find my feet. I arrived in China by train. It took about 2 weeks from London with various stops. We also had to change the rolling stock as the track sizes changed between countries to avoid invasion, I was told. I remember the relief of a Chinese restaurant car. The Russian one left a lot to be desired. I met few other travellers on this journey, but thankfully in Moscow a few Scandinavians got on, and shortly before reaching Beijing I met Connie and we launched ourselves into China together, hitting Beijing with the kind of carefree and haphazard confidence of the slightly mad youngsters that we were. We went on to Xi'an and slowly climatised to our environment. I remember the lovely girl and her family that befriended us and made us some beautiful padded jackets, which you couldn't buy in the shops. But I don't remember visiting the school. At least with my black and white film, some order can be ascertained, but where exactly pictures are taken is largely unclear. Back when I developed them, I remember being so disappointed in myself that I didn't make any notes. I can recall long train journeys of many hours, Xi'an to Chengdu and on to Kunming, meeting few other foreigners. Kunming is on the banks of a massive lake, and there I met Irene, who spoke English and minded the tea house for retired workers. I spent a couple of lovely afternoons with her. We also visited the stone forest, which got dubbed the stoned forest as marijuana plants grew like weeds, but nobody seemed to know what they were. We enjoyed smoking some and found it on the streets in town too, but I think the effect was heightened there by the pollution. We travelled further south and we became a group of 4 and decided to head to Hainan Island for Christmas. We rather slowly travelled south. We landed in at least one place we weren't allowed to be, but it was fine. Bewildered officials packed us off to a hotel and put us back on the train in the morning. When we got to Haikou, the northern capital of Hainan Island, we ran into a small group of foreigners from Shanghai University. Useful as Chinese bureaucracy was halting our trip to the south, saying we had to take and pay for a guide. However, a fluke encounter with a different bus station had us all on the bus at 6 a.m, not sure if we were going to get thrown off or not. We made it to the beach, warm weather, great food and a good fun Christmas, which was a real treat for all of us. I'm very puzzled as to why so many of these pictures are so out of focus. My colour pictures are not. Was it me or that camera body or the lens? I'll never know. What a random set of snaps. I only remember the smallest of snippets. Hainan Island had been lovely, sunny, cheap, good food and laid back. At least once we negotiated ourselves to the beach, which wasn't straightforward. Now Christmas is over and I'm back on the move. I remember taking a boat to Shanghai with a German student that spoke Chinese, but then I'm back on my own. I had moments of being more in photographer mode, but mostly I think I was still shy about it and overall didn't really know what I was doing as a photographer. Now, 40 years later, a lot of pretty indifferent photos hold an interest that I certainly didn't consider at the time. I've been in China a while, maybe a couple of months. My diaries were lost, so I have nothing concrete to take me back, but I was used to being there. I'm pretty sure I was alone and in Hangzhou for at most 1 or 2 nights. I was on an uncharacteristically touristy jaunt from Shanghai before heading back up north. I walked around without fear. I never felt fear in the 4 months I spent in China. People were friendly, obviously intrigued, having in the most part never seen a foreign person, not even on TV. TV essentially didn't exist there yet, so perhaps their only reference point was maybe a magazine, but not really even that. No TV, no foreign films, hardly any magazines. Actually, I don't remember seeing any. And yet, so bizarrely, a shop selling, among other things, Michelangelo's David sculptures. Pretty much no one spoke any English. Some people were more willing to interact than others, but there was certainly a caution, elements of fear. I was so young and naive. I knew nothing. I knew there were still strict regimes, but essentially I walked around clueless. In retrospect, I understand more, of course. I knew there were execution lists pasted up on the streets and that by our standards it didn't take too much to be added to them, so I understood their caution. Now, reviewing these rolls of film in this digital world, taking so few pictures feels quite strange. I remember feeling a bit shy, but also being fairly covert about taking pictures, never quite sure if some authority figure was going to jump out and reprimand me. But is this also an excuse for myself, because so many of the pictures are not what I would consider good, often weirdly absent of any kind of focal point, not sharp, although I'm not sure about the quality of the scans. It's true that I was guarding the use of my film stock. It was not readily available, or if I found it at all, it was extremely expensive. But I am again sharing these images that are most of a roll of film. A few of the images are good, and the black and white film makes for seductive visuals. But it is the past that I think makes these pictures intriguing, seeing past times, but also the processes of an inexperienced photographer trying to find her feet. I was determined to reach Harbin and the ice festival I'd heard about. How did we find things out in those days? Somehow we did. Anyway, with my trying to be a photographer hat on, I thought maybe I could get a picture story from this contained idea. The trouble was, my totally untrained, naive 23-year-old self still had no idea how to make a picture story, just what it actually takes to pull that off. So now, 40 years later, here is a different story. A visit to minus 30 degrees where the river freezes so thoroughly you can drive lorries over it and cut out huge chunks of ice. Any moisture freezes quickly, so small icicles form in nostrils and on eyelashes. It was an experience, but I was no closer to an elusive picture story. So I packed my bags and headed back to Beijing to work out what my next moves would be. I visited the Great Wall. I went on my own by tourist bus. It wasn't busy and there were hardly any foreigners. Then I was planning to go down to Hong Kong to find some work. However, I met Ma Yuan, an American woman, heading for a Tibetan monastery in Qinghai. I decided to go with her, and a couple of Australian boys came too. Over 800 miles it took 4 days and nights. We were trying to get there for Tibetan New Year, and this was the fastest way we could do it at the time. It involved long train journeys, which were fine, but also lengthy waits at inhospitable hours in -5 conditions. One of our better stops, in daylight hours, with enough time to explore, was Datong. We briefly visited the Yungang grottos, where the extremes of Mao had wrought its destructions, and happily ran across celebrations of stilt walkers. Then it was back on the train for the night. We got to Shening in time for Tibetan New Year and found our way out of town to the monastery, but the Chinese had made the Tibetans fall in line with their New Year, and there was nowhere to stay for at least a few days. We headed back to Shening to find a bed, renew my visa, wander around. When we returned, it was still quiet, except for the presence of a few visiting nomadic Tibetans. Reviewing all this film, I oscillate between searching for the palpable memories and feeling amazement that I was there at that time. This is a heavy edit, but I'm often asking myself, why are there so many crap pictures? I start to remember the mixed feelings about shooting at all, shy or maybe apologetic, slightly covert, certainly inexperienced. Except mostly when I make a connection with someone, when we are looking at each other, then I felt free to share the moment with the camera, it seems. We had a cold but fantastic room in the monastery complex and ended up staying about 3 weeks. I went walking in the often sunny but frosty hills. We watched the festival build and crescendo with thousands of people from all over the west of China and about 10 foreigners. There were llama dances and butter sculptures in the temple and Chinese opera down the road in the town. Not surprisingly, I have more colour photos of this. This was the first roll of film I scanned, trying out some borrowed equipment, seeing how it worked, and then quickly putting something together as a test. I've decided to include this first foray into my black and white analogues, as there is much about it that I like, and I'm not a fan of consistency anyway. It reveals more of the physicality of film and some of the process of working with it digitally, if you're attuned to that kind of thing. But it offers a different view. I labelled this roll Qinghai, which is the province, but it is mostly around Tarsa Monastery, as I called it then. It's different now. And the capital of Shening, where I left on a 42-hour train ride and hard seat, which was all that was available. But it was a direct train back to Beijing. I've sometimes been fairly harsh on myself while I've been compiling these photos. I'm a bit annoyed with myself, but more to do with what I didn't photograph. However, as I reviewed these rolls, I also made a very rough edit in a folder marked China book. As it turns out, I've ended up with more than 50 images I'm happy to put in a small book. From 15 rolls of film, that isn't too bad. I'm still slightly appalled at the quality of some of the rolls of film, but also understand that I did okay, especially since I have twice the number of colour films still to review. Most photographers will understand the feeling that they may have screwed up, and also mostly know that given a bit of time and distance, they realise that they haven't. Taking fairly good pictures is an art of sorts, but what I really understood from my efforts in China was that making a good picture story requires a set of skills much greater than shooting a few good photos.